Good afternoon, Judge.
Good afternoon.
Today is Tuesday, July 14th, 2015. We're here at the Marriott Marquis Hotel in San Diego, California. And we're here today to interview Judge Anthony Ishii in a brief video oral history to record some reflections on his career in the law. I'm Deb Kristensen, and I'm here on behalf of the Ninth Circuit Historical Society. This interview will be preserved by the Society in their archives, and you will be provided a copy for your own use when we're done. Judge, I just want to start off, we have about 30 minutes, and I promise you this should fly by, so I want to make sure I cover a couple of little areas. But if we could, maybe you could just kind of start with talking about where you grew up and a little bit about your family. I understand you were born in Santa Ana.
Yes,
is that right?
Orange County, California.
Okay. Could you tell me a little bit about your family and growing up in Southern California?
Yes, my grandparents immigrated from Japan at the turn of the century, last century, 1900s, and settled in Orange County. At that time, Orange County was very rural, and they did some farming there. And so I grew up in a very rural environment, and then in the 50s and the early 60s, there was this big housing boom in Orange County because Los Angeles was growing, et cetera, and so we moved up to the Fresno area in 1962. I finished up high school, junior college there, and went away to school.
What did your family do? What was your
Well,
dad?
they were in farming.
Okay.
They were in farming in Orange County, and then when they moved up to Fresno County, they were still in farming.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's just that the land became so valuable for housing that most of the farm folks pretty much sold out. So you don't see much of the farmland anymore in Orange County.
It's hard to think about Orange County as being a big farm area today.
Yeah, that's right. That's how you would not recognize it back in the day, that's for sure.
So you moved to Fresno then in the 60s?
Yes,
And was your family, did they continue to be involved in farming there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And did you help out on the farm?
I did, which is probably why my father let me go off into the law, because he knew I was not a farmer. I was just not. I didn't have the talent. I didn't have the abilities. I think the best thing for the farm and for the family and for me was to get rid of me. So they had me move on.
Okay. So tell me about then moving on. Where'd you go to college?
I went to the University of Pacific in Stockton as a pharmacy major. And so I graduated from pharmacy school in 1970. I took the state boards in California, then Nevada, and by that time I had already been accepted into law school. So right after that, I started law school.
All right, I need to pause for effect because you were a pharmacy major and you took your licenses, but you were also applying to law school. Tell me how the pharmacy, where did your interest in pharmacy come from?
Well, when I started off let me back up a little bit. I think for a lot of kids, when you're growing up, law seemed to be the glamorous sort of thing, but I didn't have a lot of, I had very little exposure to the law, the legal system, lawyers or judges, and so that dream just sort of faded, and I was trying to think of some other profession, a noble profession, if you will. They always talk about doctors or lawyers, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I took a biology class, and we were dissecting a frog, and I almost fainted, so I knew I was not going to get into the medical arena other than something like pharmacy. So that's what I did, and I enjoyed it. I didn't have any regrets about going into pharmacy school, but by my last year in pharmacy school, I and a couple of my other classmates were interested in law, and so it just sort of progressed very quickly, and I don't want to sound too facetious, but it was not something that I had planned out. I would go to pharmacy school and then to law school because that would have been very foolish, as it turned out in hindsight, because it took a lot of time. But so that's how the transition, it was fairly quick. And I went from a very rural, conservative community, a very conservative university. UOP had just very recently disaffiliated from being a Methodist university, and I went to Berkeley, and that was quite a dramatic change. Berkeley in the 70s, exactly, yeah.
So you moved to Berkeley then in
1970.
1970, and that was to go to law school?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever work as a pharmacist?
I did. I worked a little bit, and the sort of funny story I tell folks is that this was Berkeley in the 70s, and I worked in a pharmacy just off Telegraph Avenue, which is where a lot of the hippie type activity took place. And so I was living in the dorm at the law school in Berkeley, and I'd walk down Telegraph Avenue with my smock, and I used to be able to brag that I was the only legitimate drug dealer on Telegraph Avenue.
That's great. How long did you work as a pharmacist through law school?
Yes, I did.
Oh,
I did.
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the summers and in law school, etc. So, but then after that, I had thought about, well, I would transition and get into something with the medical field or pharmacy and the law, but I never did. So I kept my license up for a number of years and finally went inactive after 20 years.
So you talked about maybe an early interest in the law. Did you have anybody in your family, or what gave you an interest in the law? Just that it was a noble profession?
Yeah, it was interesting. I guess for a lot of young people, you hear about the glamour of the law. Now, I will say this, and this is probably true with a lot of immigrant families. The law or the legal profession was not necessarily something that my family was interested in for me, because a lot of the exposure that they had to the law was pretty negative. You had a lot of the laws that related to immigrants, Chinese Exclusion Act, and of course the Japanese with the relocation. So the experiences with the law were pretty negative. So it wasn't something, they said, well, become a doctor or pharmacist, but not a lawyer. So, but I did have an uncle who was an appellate court justice, and we were not really close, but he was well respected. But other than that, I didn't really have any exposure to to lawyers or judges. So it was just something that I just had to learn as I went along as to the interest and what I would be able to do.
And did your family support you making that change?
Yes, very much so. Once I made the transition, they were pretty happy. I don't think my parents were real happy after 6 years, 2 years of junior college, 4 years of pharmacy school, and then all of a sudden I'm telling them I want to go to college another 3 years, which didn't make them happy. But they were very supportive, I have to say. Once the notion settled in, they were very supportive.
They're okay.
Yeah.
Did you have a particular area that you became interested in law school, or did you just like the law in general?
Yeah, I liked it in general. I really didn't have any specific, and one of the interesting things, to me it's sort of interesting, is, like I took criminal law and procedure because you had to do it. It was one of those requirements. I had never any intention of practicing criminal law, but it's something I had to take. My second job out of law school was the public defender's office in Fresno County. So I did criminal law, and of course, as a judge, you do a lot of criminal law. So I tell people who are applying to law school, even law students, you have the flexibility, unless you know really the area that you specifically want to be in, you need to be flexible and just see what comes up and finally interests you. And a lot of the areas of law interest, certainly criminal law, was very interesting.
So did you come out of law school thinking that's where I was going to end up, is I'm interested in criminal law and I'm going to go that area, or was that just the opportunities as they presented themselves?
They were, because my first job was with the city attorney's office in Sacramento. And so we did municipal law, and we're a fairly small department, and we didn't do anything in terms of criminal law, not even misdemeanors or anything like that. All the code enforcement was done by different agencies, but not our office. So we're basically in-house counsel to the city council and to the various departments. What got me interested initially in criminal law was that, I had this notion out of law school that lawyers are supposed to go into court. But because we were basically in-house counsel for the city, we rarely went into court. And so I thought, well, I'd like to get into court. And people said, well, if you want to get into court, get into criminal law, public defender's office, district attorney's office, you'll always be in court. And I also wanted to move back to Fresno, so that sort of combined. I applied, and I have to admit, I did not have any political leanings for prosecution or defense. I applied to both offices.
Oh, good.
And it
Really?
turned out that
This is the one that gave you the job.
Yeah, the public defender's office made the offer first. So I went down there, and I thought, well, I'll see what it's like. I just wanted to get back into Fresno, and I wanted to get some courtroom experience. And I really enjoyed it. So I stayed there almost 3 years. And the only reason I left is I thought, well, okay, now's the time that I should get out into private practice. But I enjoyed it a lot. And it gave me a great exposure. At that time, Fresno County was fairly small. There were 8 Superior Court judges and 7 municipal court judges. And being in public defender's office, we were in court regularly, so I got to appear in front of every one of the judges, which was a great experience for me, just to see different judges, their styles, what I liked about what they did, what I didn't like about what they did, et cetera. So
especially
it was a great
as a young lawyer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, really get to see how it works.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Good. So then you left the public defender's office and went into private practice?
Exactly, yes.
Was it just you, or did you join a firm? Or
you know, it was another person who was out in private practice, and he wanted me to join him. So we formed a partnership and practice, and then I expanded out to do, you know, civil practice. So I was doing both criminal law and civil law, just getting a feel for civil law. I assumed that at some point I would just transition over to primarily civil law. But then the opportunity arose to be in a judicial position. And for people unfamiliar with the California judicial system back in the 70s, there were superior courts and municipal courts, and there were also justice courts. Municipal courts, the distinction at that time very broadly was that the municipal court handles obviously lesser cases, but the jurisdictional limit was $25,000, and the requirement for a municipal court back then was that you had to have a population of 40,000 or more. Well, there were a number of counties in California that didn't have a population of 40,000, and so for them they developed, it started off as a justice of the peace sort of thing, and then it transitioned to justice court. So a number of counties had justice courts instead of municipal courts because of the population requirements, and there were a number of counties that had areas that needed to be served, that they didn't have the population base, and that was true of Fresno County. So in Fresno County, there was a Fresno County Municipal Court, which basically served the Fresno area, city of Fresno area. And then all of the outlying little cities, there were like 14 other little cities in Fresno County, and all of them had a justice court. And it wasn't unusual. Back then, there were more justice courts than there were municipal courts. Los Angeles County, for example, had Catalina Island, was a justice court. So it was not uncommon, even in the bigger counties, to have justice courts. The unique thing about a justice court position, justice court judge position, was that it was appointed by the Board of Supervisors. So the Fresno County, So the Fresno County Board of Supervisors appointed justice court judges for Fresno County. So at any rate, an opening came up, and I applied, and I was appointed by the Board of Supervisors for 2 smaller cities in Fresno County. And I thought at that time, justice court judges could also practice law. So I thought, oh, this was the best of both worlds.
Do a little
I
both.
I could be a judge and I could be a practicing lawyer. Now, obviously, there were conflict problems because when a justice court judge appears before another judge, it was a little awkward, but it seemed to work out okay. But at any rate, so I got that appointment, and my workload in that particular justice court continued to grow. And so it got to the point where I knew I couldn't do both. So I just closed my practice and became a full-time justice court judge. And then all the justice courts in the rural areas, we consolidated into a municipal court district because that gave us the population base. So then there were 2 municipal court districts in Fresno County, and then of course later on there was a consolidation in which the Superior Court and municipal courts consolidated together, and we had already started that process in Fresno County before it became an actual law. So we worked closely with the Superior Court in Fresno to what we call coordination. And then just before the actual consolidation of the municipal courts and the superior courts into one superior court, that's when I was appointed to the federal court bench.
So how long had you, from the time that you had moved down to Fresno and had first been a public defender and then went into private practice, how long were you a judge in one capacity or another before you went on the federal bench?
I was appointed in 1983 and to the Justice Court bench, and then of course I transitioned to a muni court. And then in 1997 I became a district court judge. So it was 14 years as a justice, then municipal court judge.
I want to talk a little bit. I've talked to a few judges about becoming a federal court judge, and and how it's such an amazing process to have to be, nominated by the United States president, go through the Senate. Tell me about that process, how you got to that point. Had you been putting out feelers, telling people that you may be interested in if a spot comes open? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. The thing about the Eastern District of California, there are two basic offices. One is in Sacramento, one is in Fresno. The Fresno division had two positions, two district court judge positions. So the opportunity, it was very rare, because with just the two, it's whenever any of them went senior, and that could be 10, 12 years. So the openings didn't come up very often. And so at that point in time, one of the district judges took senior status, and I thought about applying, and then I was contacted by some folks and said, you ought to put your name in. So I said, okay, and so I did, and it was a very interesting process. I mean, it is something that was interesting. It was very unique. There was no way for me to know, okay, how do you do this properly?
You didn't have coaching or somebody saying, here's what's going to happen, and let's like do a mock interview or any of that kind of stuff. You just
there wasn't. I suppose if I'd reached out, maybe someone might have told me. But again, part of it is from the local folks. They really didn't know, because there were so few openings that when one came up, and there was a scramble. I mean, there were a lot of people applying, so. I'm sure there were a lot of diverse viewpoints as to how you would proceed on that. So, it was an interesting process. At that time, it was President Clinton who was the president, and the Senate was controlled by the Republican Party. And as you know, when the president is of a different party, and it doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican, when the other side, when the Senate is on the other side, oftentimes the appointment process, if you will, is contentious. And it was at that point in time. There were a number of nominees who had been held up, who ultimately became distinguished jurists. So they were well qualified, but there was that political tension, and that's what I wound up being involved in.
How long did your process take from the time that your name was submitted until your confirmation? Was it a long, drawn-out process or pretty quick?
It was, partly because of the timing. I was recommended by Senator Boxer in February of 1996, and I went through the background process. I was cleared by the FBI, I was cleared by the IRS, et cetera, the American Bar Association. And so I had done all of the preliminary stuff, and then I got a call from the White House around May of 1996. Now, this was a presidential election year, and a number of President Clinton's nominees were stuck at the Senate Judiciary Committee level. And so the White House said their strategy is it was going to change. They weren't going to continue to nominate people, because what was happening, they said, was that the Senate would then sort of pick and choose, and some of the people who had been languishing for a while weren't getting the opportunity at least to be heard by the committee. So they said they're not going to recommend or nominate anybody until they process these folks through. So here I was, May of 1996. I was told, nope, we're not going to do anything. It wasn't the Senate, it was the White House decision.
Oh, wow.
And so my fate rested on the 96 election. Well,
wow.
Bill Clinton got reelected in 1996. 1997 in January, he renominated a lot of us who had not gone through the process. And so then I had my Senate hearing.
How'd that go?
Is
that an intimidating process?
Very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, because, and it's understandable that, they weren't going to be particularly friendly to a Clinton nominee because the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. But they were very fair. Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah was the chair. And I've told people this afterwards. He was very fair. I have absolutely no qualms about how he handled the process, the questions that he asked, etc. But it's very intimidating. And the interesting thing is they had it set say that the Senate doesn't give you a lot of notice. They don't say 2 weeks from now. I was in court on Monday, and I received a call that said, be here tomorrow because the Senate has you set for Wednesday. And so the Department of Justice wanted me to come in the next day. So I called my wife. She scrambled, got me a flight, and so I.
Did you go by yourself, or did
Yeah,
you
I
have your
did.
wife or
and
friends?
my wife and son came a day late. They arrived in time for the hearing, but obviously I needed to get there to get briefed by the Department of Justice on Tuesday. So it was very hectic.
Wow.
And they normally hold hearings in the Senate offices, which is convenient for the senators, but we received notice that morning, and actually I hadn't received it. My wife called me to let me know that they had changed the location of the hearing. It was not going to be in the Senate offices. It was going to be actually outside of the Senate chambers because they were having an important vote, and they were going to be there. So they moved the location of the hearing. Fortunately, I found out about it.
You don't want to miss that, right? You not get that.
And here's the thing: it was June, and it was hot, and it was humid, and the room wasn't air conditioned. And I was thinking, they had an ad there: "Don't ever let them see you sweat." Right. And I said, "Oh my God, I'm going to walk in there and I'm going to sweat, like crazy." But I made it through okay, and there were 4 of us. Actually, there were 5 of us, and one of them was arguably controversial, and it was sort of. The 5 of us were sitting there, and the Senator had said, "Okay, the 4, me and 3 others, please come forward to the chair area." But the other person was not called forward, and so we're all sitting there going, "Uh-oh, he's not going anywhere." So we sat there, and fortunately, because there were 4 of us, and they were asking questions. It was sort of like this interview. It went pretty fast. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of obviously pointed questions. So we made it through okay, and I did not sweat. And
Good
so
for you.
yeah, so then we made it through, and then in October, the Senate held a hearing on the full Senate, and they confirmed me.
So it was like a year and a half after your original name was submitted.
Yeah,
that took a long time.
Yeah.
Wow. And so tell me about how you learned that you had just been confirmed.
I had, it was October 9th, which is my wedding anniversary, which was
really?
significant.
That's a date that you won't forget.
Yeah, exactly. And so I got the call, and actually it was just from the White House, and indicated that I had been confirmed. And so that was great. And so we knew the good thing, of course, I was already on the bench. So, I think for private practitioners, it's much more difficult, because you've got your clients,
Sure.
Can you take new cases? What are you going to do about the existing cases and clients? But for a sitting judge, it was much easier, and so I could make the transition fairly quickly. So I got word that I had been confirmed on October 9th of that year, and then a couple of weeks later, I went in just to get sworn in so I could be official. And it turned out that the last Friday of the month of October happened to be October 31, which is Halloween. So I went with my family just to get sworn. It was very private. We had an investor's ceremony a couple of weeks later. But we have something of a fun-loving courthouse. And so a lot of the clerical staff was dressed up in costumes. So here are my parents, they didn't know much about the law or the court system. Fortunately, they'd never been in the courthouse. So here was this very solemn thing. Their son was going to get sworn in. They walk in the courtroom, and there's all these people in costumes. And thinking, oh my gosh, is this the federal courthouse? So anyway, that was
quite a beginning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. That's great. So there was 2 positions in Fresno. Who was the other judge that you joined on the bench at the time? Okay,
there were 2 of us. Bob Coyle was the judge that took senior status. He remained on.
Okay.
Oliver Wanger was the other judge. And then we had M.D. Crocker, who was a senior judge, who was also on the bench. So at that time, there were actually the 2 active and 2 senior judges, so it was good.
So you talked about your courthouse and the people. Tell me a little bit about the the people that you worked with so let me just give you, so you started the bench in 1997, the federal bench.
Yes.
And you just in 2012 went senior.
Right.
Is that right? And you're still taking cases,
Yes.
correct? Okay.
Right.
Tell me about the collegiality, or what the other folks in the courthouse in working their relationships with the clerk's office, with the other judges and chambers and stuff, if you could, a little bit.
Yeah, it's really, and it was then and is still now a very collegial. We're still a relatively small court, although we're a large district. Within the Fresno division, again, with 2 district judges, and then with our magistrate judges and our bankruptcy judges, it's still a fairly small court. So it's like being in a small courthouse. It's very friendly, very collegial.
I need to ask you, somebody told me I should ask you about pie. And said that you would know what that means in terms of collegiality. Could you? I see that you do.
I do. The original courthouse, we're in a newer courthouse, but it was 5 stories tall, and the district judges, we were on the 5th floor, and the clerk's office on the 5th floor, but we really didn't get a chance on a day-to-day basis to get together. So I just had this idea, well, why don't I just have a little pie party? I'll just buy some pies, we'll cut them up, we'll invite everybody to come in, and everyone can help themselves to a slice of pie, and we can sit down and chat. And it worked out really well, so periodically during the course of the year, I'll just have a pie party, and I guess I had so many that people just assume.
Do you still do that?
Yeah, I do, yeah. In fact, if I don't do it, some of the staff say, when are you going to have a pie party again? So, it's nice. It was just an opportunity, very informal, no speeches, nothing particularly special. Just, hey, you've got time, 15 minutes, come on up, and we'll just share a slice of pie.
What a nice idea.
Yeah.
That's great. Being down in Fresno, did you ever, I know that the Eastern District of California's caseload has increased amazingly. Did that require you to travel around more? Did it require more people to come into your district and help you? How did you manage all of that?
Yeah, it really, we have a very heavy caseload because everyone's busy, but we were particularly impacted. There are 4 districts in the state of California. Our district is more rural, and in terms of building prisons, our area was ideal because it was very rural. So the vast majority of the state prisons are located in our district, and a number of the federal facilities are now located in our district. And of course that generates lawsuits that wind up in the federal court, either habeas cases or prisoner civil rights cases. So I would say that probably maybe 40% of our caseload are prisoner cases. Of course they're pro se, so they require a lot more hands-on work. And and then of course our population has grown. We had, at one time, I shouldn't say one time, but we had 7 district judges. One was a temporary position. And so basically what Congress could do is they could actually renew that or extend that temporary position, but they didn't do that. So although our population, our workload was growing, we actually lost a judgeship. So we went from 7 to 6. And again, because of the increase in the population, the caseload, without the increase in the judgeships, we've been tremendously impacted. And I will say this, the circuit has been cognizant of that. The National, the Administrative Office has been cognizant of that. They've been doing everything they can to help us out. And we did have a few years ago a call for volunteers, and we actually had over 100 judges that volunteered to take cases. They took about 1,000 of our cases. Unfortunately, they took some cases which really helped us a lot, but cases were still coming in. So
didn't stem the flow.
Yeah, exactly.
It just helped you catch up a little bit.
Yeah, I always liken it to your basement is flooding, and you're trying to dump out buckets of water, and your friends come in and they take a bucket of water apiece and lowers the level, but then they leave and the water's still pouring in, so you're still doing your best to do it. So anyway, that's sort of a crude analogy, but that's sort of how
you've handled, now that you're senior, it sounds like you're still working a lot. Are you still pretty full-time, or?
I cut back to a 50% caseload last year, but I kept all the cases that I had, so it's taken a while to process those through, and we're starting to feel the impact. And the Sacramento